We start today by taking a few of the trees that we have painted in a single dark colour last week and revisit them in full colour, so that we have to be aware now of lights and darks and shadows on the foliage. Using greens and keeping the form and shape of the trees in mind, we will paint the palm and the pine trees again. But before we do the painting, we need to talk about greens. There are many various tube colours in green, but I find that most of them are unsuitable for the colours in our Australian landscape. They tend to be too bright and unnatural from my point of view. So while I have a couple of greens on my palette, I also mix them from regular colours in my palette. Not just blues and yellow, but also with a little bit of red to add even more realism. It can be handy to have a mid and a dark green for convenience, but even then I tend to change them up on the paper. Let me show you how. Tonight what we're doing is more or less the same as what we did last week, except we'll do them in colour. And I have also added a couple other ones that are already flowering trees, and so they have lots of colour in them as well, or even just an autumn tree. I was actually going to talk colour first anyway, and so what I'm going to do is very quickly on a cheap piece of paper just work with my colour palette so that you see where it is I go with that. Now with that I start with a lemon. Now lemon is fine. I often have sort of started using, and I think I've got that over top now, so that's not going to work well. More of it's called a yellow green of some kind, or yellow gold or something like that. No, really the green gold, sorry. The reason I do that is because mostly when I work with landscapes, it just fits into the palette a little bit nicer than a straight yellow. And that's that one. Then I work with a warm yellow. That can be something like Indian. This one is actually a My Marie colour, which is called Permanent Yellow Deep. Anything that's got that orangey look to it is what we're looking for in the warm yellow. A cooler red that's actually a bit pinky, I know, but there is a deeper one too if I had it.
You're calling that cool red?
I am.
Is that Alex?
It's probably more of a pink, a permanent rose, or a primary red magenta. So that way, but alizarin is definitely the way to go with that. The red is something like that. So your fire engine type red. So you can see where they're quite different. That one's got a lot more orange into it. That one has got a lot of blue, more blue into it. And I'll explain those a little bit more shortly. Next is, let's get the colour out of my brush. I'm going to go straight into a green. Because I do lots of anything to do with landscapes, I do now find it easier if we have a couple of greens on the palette. This one is, I often recommend either a sap green, depending if it's not too bright and cheerful. Some of them are, depends on a brand as well. Olive green for Australia, because we have a lot of that sort of thing. And so some of those colours are, so it's mostly about being a mid-green. because I rarely ever just use green like that anyway. I usually add yellows or reds or blues to them anyway. The next one is a dark green. Now, mostly they'll be because they're darker, they'll be more blue. And again, you can see how that one's got more yellow into it and that one's got more blue into it. So 1, 2 and 3, I've got my greens. And so it gives me a good mix of various colours to work with. The next one is a blue, and good old cerulean is very useful for anything to do with skies, water.
Which one is that?
Cerulean. Cobalt, love cobalt, it's a beautiful colour. Cobalt sometimes in the student quality, because it is a more expensive colour, you may not get the richness of colour, and the same goes with cerulean. They often make a cerulean out of a phthalo colour, which I tend not to like as much.
What's a phthalo colour?
Phthalo colour is something like this. I have it on my palette, and when it's used full strength, it is really quite a jumpy colour and and the other thing I don't like about it is that it stains.
Oh, it's the PT.
PT.
That's right, yeah.
PTHALO.
Stains, did you say?
It is a staining colour. Yeah. So you have to watch that. Having said that, with an earth colour, it can make a really, really intense dark green as well. So it's not that it's not useful. There's different ways to work with it. Lastly, on the blue, sort of last, is ultramarine. Can't go past ultramarine. It's always just useful regardless. And then something, I like Payne's Grey. I'm going to say this is probably indigo because
You didn't have it.
I haven't got Payne's Grey, but it's a very similar colour. It's probably, some Payne's Grey can be quite grey, almost to the black. The main reason I like Payne's Grey is because it is dark. You get some really intense darks with that, so that's been the main reason. So again, as you use it full strength, it really does pick up some nice strong dark there as well. But of course we were using that same colour last week anyway. Then we go to earth colours. Now, raw sienna is often one that is used. I tend not to use it. It's actually probably, that is still a raw umber, though it's dark, not as dark as I like. It's, raw umber is what I consider a dirty yellow, or an earth yellow is probably a better term for it. And I find that way more useful than raw sienna, which tends to be even more yellow. I find that's plenty yellow enough for everything that I do. The earth red often is burnt sienna. And again, these earth colours change a lot depending on your brands.
Like
And the burnt umber is the other colour I put on there. This one, again, is something similar to that. Will do the trick. It is also so, and again, that one being just a dark brown. So, I mean, your sepias are fine, your warm sepia, your other colours like that would still all do the trick. So just because you don't have exactly the same colours as what I've got, I'm okay with that if they're going to do the same trick as this. So really on those ones, I don't usually have the lemon that much, and I don't usually have phthalo. I've got them on my palette, but I tend not to use them all that often. The other colours, on the other hand, I use a lot. So I might just put a name on the names on them, but there's too many variations out there to really be able to do that anyway, specifically. The best idea is to actually get to know your own palette. So learn which is which, and so that when I say, oh yeah, we're just going to use that or that, and I'll pick up a colour that's similar to this, you will actually understand which way to go.
What's the difference between a good colour and one which is not so good? Is it concentration of pigment? What is it?
Yes, often there are. Some of them end up with a little bit of white look to them as well. If you get the really El Chico ones, I might actually pick a few up and I can explain that better by showing them to you. But I'd have to, they're just in the storeroom at the moment, that's all. And so even the cheaper paints will still do the warm and cools.
Yes.
And the earth colours.
Yes.
The other thing is that they're not light fast. And I think it's always good to use the best quality materials that you can.
Yes.
But, if that's where you start, well, that's where you start.
Yes.
But at the same time, when you can afford to move on. And sometimes you just pick up those cheaper sets without actually knowing what they do or how they work differently. So it is sometimes about having strength of colour. Sometimes it's also about having more opacity.
I was about to ask that, yes.
Yes, opacity is, and often that opacity comes in by them adding white to get the lighter blue or something like that.
Right.
And they're much harder to work with that way. They're harder to mix colours that way. And so you just have to work with that type of thing when you're deciding on which paints to work with. And yeah, so you will get a result, but you possibly would find out that they just don't quite do the same thing as what I'm working with here, and they will be the same. If you choose other colours that are different or only just slightly different, you'll get a slightly different result. It's not that big a deal. So, which is why I'm not too set on having exactly the same as what I've got in my palette. I tend to pick and choose anyway, and I don't often have the same colours. Okay, right, so let's work on using some colours. So we'll stick with something that's basically green. So the choices here are to use a green or do we mix a green. If you need to mix a green, for something like a lighter green you would use your lemon, and I'll just do a little swatch down here with one of your blues. It does depend on the blue. I would not be using that, certainly not with this. Where are we? I'll just show you why not. Because it's a little bit in your face, not quite your usual green. Whereas if mixing it with your ultramarine, for instance, will give you a nicer, more usable colour. See how I'll just try, so they change. Now to use a warm yellow with your, I'll just show you the difference with using those two colours and see, hang on, I missed a bit. So using your warm yellow with that colour is not too bad. It will actually pick up something that is okay. To use it with your ultramarine, it goes quite a bit grayer. So mixing colours is great. You get to know your colours quite quickly if you start mixing them. For this one, I'm just going to use the colours 1, 2 and 3. I'm just going to use on this one. and that's again, if you need to, you would use your lemon or green gold with a couple of blues, but you have to be a little bit more. And again, your cobalt or your ultramarine will probably give you a better colour mix than these other ones. So I'll just start there. Now I'm not actually, remember last week we didn't actually draw this, so I'm not going to draw it again tonight either. So I'm going to use my green gold. I almost always start with a lighter colour first. The reason for that is that it just works better. Working with that. Now again we're working with our lights. Now there is actually more shadow on the left hand, on this side, than there is this one. Obviously that's where the light was happening. And so it becomes a little bit more piecemeal than what it was last week. The other thing with using different colours, I often use a second or even a third brush sometimes. So to come back in with that one, a little bit of more green. A little bit more of a... You can already see how that changed the green colour that I was using, just by having it there as in amongst, actually mixing with that colour.
Sorry, the photo is pretty much all dark green, but you're putting a lot of yellow with it.
Yeah, that happens shortly. I think because I still want to be able to actually just work with it a little bit more.
So
make
that's
it
your
more
base colour,
interesting.
and then you're going to go.
Yeah, I think so. Probably. I mean, you are right, because we could have gone with that being the darker colour straight up. Hang on, just mixing.
So,
So to what I'm looking for here is just those few highlights without, so catching the light so that it doesn't go all straight dark, straight up. And that way, so it's almost quite different to our working with it last week, where we were just looking at shape. So now we have to contemplate how the paints work together and where the lights and shades are as well, and also various colours. So pretty much I'm happy with that. A little bit something happening at the top. I might just come back in with a little bit more here. And there was actually a stem. Good grief. Let's try a trunk. Even though I've ended up putting green on that, I don't think it really matters. And we need to ground it out. In fact, there'll probably be something that's a little bit brassy, just to make something on the bottom. So you can see where there's some darks, there's some lights, and there's some mids, and that's what we're looking for in anything that we're doing, all right? And like I said, it's easier being able to pick up a few of those darker colours and the mid-tones. A different way we possibly could have worked with that is still started with your mid-tone, your base green, and then come back in with some lighter yellow and your darker green in it, or even a blue. While I'm at it, I'll just show you what an ultramarine or how that changes what's happening. I don't mind using ultramarine as a sort of like almost like a dark as well on top of some of these colours. It changes the look of it. but I consider that to be, comes in with the blue. That's a bit muddy there, but it'll do. Okay, and I'll just do one more painting of something, and then I'll let you go over. We're going to, I think we did the, oh well, we're sort of in this spiky thing, so we might well just do that one as well. Now, I think I used the flat brush for the palm tree last week, and I'm just going to start with some raw umber as the trunk. With a little bit of brown perhaps coming in on one side. So again, trying to use that colour. Oops, I'm getting a bit all over the place today. And if we want a bit more oomph to some of that, we'll just go a bit darker on the colour. A bit more variation wouldn't go astray. Okay, so especially up here where it's actually darker in amongst that. Now again with our, let's start with a mid-tone this time, just so that you see how that works as well. Okay, so again we were using our brushes in a, it's a little bit too bright green for my liking, but it'll do for the moment. We'll work with it. And some of those were... Now one thing to watch when you're doing the palm tree is that you don't have it all colouring out like a little star shape, okay? Because even though it sort of does, at the same time they are coming from different areas within that tree. So it's worth just not just coming straight from the outside, but actually working your way so that some of these come just little bits from this way or that way as well. Now, again, I'll go with a warm yellow this time so that we get a little bit of different variation. And I'm just going to come over, no, that's not working for me. It needs to be a raw umber. That was, from my point of view, far too yellow. So I'm just going to come back in with a raw umber. And part of that is because my green is a little bit yick, so I'm going to have to play with that when the camera's off. To fix it up a bit. But this is what you get for trying to use up other tubes that you don't normally work with. But that's okay, I think. And lastly, I'm going to use ultramarine this time. No, yes, ultramarine's good. As I'll give it a try anyway. I'll still get that same look of dark, but it'll actually have that very much a blueness to it, which I don't mind actually. It often use this within the realm of keeping it for darks, for shadows. A few darker ones that are actually behind here as well. And I think that's it. There's a little bit of the nut type thing. I'm just going to put some of that in the middle here. I should have put them in first, shouldn't I? I usually do things wrong in class when I'm teaching, just so that you know.
And what did you get them?
I try my best because I'm a shock at where it comes
When
to.
you paint them upside down, that's got to be right.
So anyway, that'll give you a bit of an indication on how we work with colour, two lots of different colours. Okay.
Don't like the blue.
Don't like the blue? Okay, so use a dark green instead. If you've got a dark green on your palette, use that. If you don't, you'll have to mix one.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's a personal choice, and I don't have a problem with that. Okay, your turn. Okay, so this time we're going to start a little bit differently. What I want to explain, we're going to try these again because I think we're struggling with the shapes as much as the lights and the darks. So what I want to explain is that this tree is not, has branches that come forward. So as you're actually looking at it in a photo, it's all flattened out. But you have to remember this has got three-dimensional form. Now some of that is these branches that have come in front. And so what we're doing is actually giving ourselves some form in front as well. So as I do this, what I'm doing is giving myself some of these front ones, and then as I go up, each of these has its own, it's a branch with leaves on it. It's not a whole tree with leaves on it, you know what I mean? There's a difference. So each of these has its own branch. So if you work with that, and so don't ignore the edges. I'm going to come straight back in and do a bit of mid-tone straight away so that we get more of that form happening. So some of this will be darker. Oh, by the way, when I was playing with this colour and it wasn't working for me, I did that deliberately so that you could see what I knew not to do, okay? That's my story and I'm sticking to it.
So Roger, what are you using over the top there?
This is the mid-green. I'm going to call it mid-green because it is, everybody has a slightly different colour. If you're looking for a name...
So you're not using a blue to get a green?
No, I have to admit I am not, which is why I use a sap green, because I find the sap green is a good in-between one. That mid-green, that actually gives me that effect. The other thing is, see how the edges are feathered? Now the reason I use rough paper and working with my brush very lightly is so that I get that sort of mark, okay? So as I work with this, see that's probably a little bit of something coming in over the top. And same here. So that could be one that's just sitting in there in the middle. So some of it I'm leaving that yellow, the lighter yellow, in underneath. This one seems to be a rogue branch. It's a little bit longer than perhaps it should be, or I need to have some darker ones, some longer ones here as well. The other thing I suppose to think about is that there is actually a stem here. Stem, did I say that again? Oh gosh. Rosalind, they're called trunks. So if I put the trunk in straight away, so that it perhaps reminds me, but I don't want it everywhere because with the branches and the leaves going over top of it, I'm not going to be able to see all of that branch, that trunk. And I'm quite happy for you to tell me the right terminology anytime. I've discovered that only sometimes can I paint and talk at the same time. So, oops, that's a little bit wet just there. I might just grab more paint.
How do you fix that if you inadvertently use
Too much.
too much? I mean, it's too wet or it's got too much colour.
Look, I could perhaps just dab a little bit of it back. Maybe it's the shape that I didn't like, and then come back in with some stronger paint. It's probably still a little bit wet there. I could just leave it alone for a minute, or I could come back in and use a little bit of the lighter colour as well. I don't want too much light on the top here because it isn't actually like that very much. This is too much here. Okay, and then finally is the dark. Now I can either go with a dark green, or I can go with an ultramarine or some other dark blue. I think I still prefer to go with the dark green this time because it's a very green tree, and so again working with that. And I'm not using a lot of water at the moment. I don't want it to be, I might even just add a bit of ultramarine. So here I'm just using a little bit of that to work through. Now I'm still just working with what I've already got, trying to here in the bottom anyway, because I don't want to lose those extra white lights. And then coming here, trying to keep that going as the areas of the branches, so that we've got that randomness happening as well. Yeah, I am just using the tip of my brush a bit more, just there where I needed it to be more specific, I suppose. Now I'll just try this section here. Hopefully it won't be quite so wet as what had happened before. I think that'll be fine. Again, across the colour. I really should go to a smaller brush. I find it would be even better. And just a little bit of that darker thing up here. They also don't all come 1, 2, 3 up as well. So try and make them, always think about the shape and make them a little bit interesting as you go along. And pretty much I think I'm done. If I play any more, I would be just mucking there. So a little bit extra dark just down the bottom. I think that's possibly as good as that one's going to get. I'll just put a bit extra dark here though. Okay, that's fine. Okay, now the palm tree again. This time with so again just working with raw umber. Oh, I should actually go the other way because it's the lighter side is this way. Oops. Help if I could actually have a straight tree. Maybe it's got a bend in it. Do they have bends in it? A little bit.
Could be slightly.
Yeah. So this one's not quite straight, but we'll believe it's fine. And on the other side, we're going to make that a little bit darker by using burnt umber or sepia or something else that's just a dark brown. You'll notice that I'm not actually making it all be a nice straight line. The reason for that is that I actually find it far more interesting for it to be rough. And so that way I can have a more, I'm always for more natural products. And so yeah. Okay, now the foliage. The foliage on that one, we're finished with it. The foliage on this one is doing the same thing as what I was mentioning here. It's actually coming out towards us. And so that is something that you have to think about. So if we're doing some of that, this is one of the reasons that you put the lights in first. Is because this, so I'm sort of looking at these being a little bit from the front. So these ones are probably coming from the centre-ish towards me. And so there's going to be foreshortening. This is called the perspective thing. We love perspective as well. We'll get into that a little bit more next week as well. And then as far as these ones go, again, looking at the tops of them, not trying necessarily to make them each one exactly right. It's about getting a suggestion of these going in the form that they take. There's not too many of the light ones down in this area, and so I'm actually going to avoid putting any that lighted lemonish colour here. Okay, so even though it sort of looks like I'm coming from the centre, you'll notice that I haven't put anything there. The other reason for that is I'm going to do what I should have done last time, which is to put those orangey, I don't even know what they are. Nuts.
Yeah,
Nuts. They're nuts.
The fruit.
Yeah, it's the fruit of them and the fruit oil. And so that way, and monkey nuts is actually what we used to call them, or something similar. Quite interesting flavour, by the way. I don't know whether these ones are monkey nuts, probably not, but we used to have palm trees when I grew up, and we'd just call them monkey nuts, and there's one around town I know of. Okay, alright, so now into the mid-tones, because the mid-tone here is probably, again, the more useful bit. Even on the edges, it's not about making them all even the right they're not all, okay, what can I say? They're not all one whole branch that you're seeing either. You're only seeing parts thereof sometimes. And so you have to think about how that works. So some of them will be full on bits and pieces, but it'd be nice if I could
Been a long day.
talk. Working all day doesn't help.
Yeah.
That's all right.
I've got no excuse.
Should be used to it by now. And I am to an extent. So looking over here and again, they fold over differently. Again, not all of them are perfectly formed. There you go, that'll do. So some do have the darker edges, So I'm having a lighter edge. We will go in here with a little bit of dark as well, in amongst my nuts, berries, fruit, any of the above. And I'm going to probably put a bit of this down in here, even though those ones are behind. It's quite dark just there, but at the same time I don't know that we need to go quite that dark. So I'm going to add some of that there. Just an odd one that goes weird. And something like that. Now, and I could go my blue. I still, oh well, I'm piking out. I'm using a mixed colour. If you don't have your dark green, you can definitely use either a mix of a blue and a yellow, or even just sometimes the blue on its own. Now you will notice how dark I'm using it. It's not a bright colour. It's not a wishy-washy one. You really are using the colour as strong as you can to make it look so that there's this contrast. Contrast is really quite important in most things that we paint. So most of the time when I'm doing this, I end up having paint that's quite strong, which is one of the reasons we mix up our paints ready to go before we start, and I didn't mention that tonight, of course. That's always a good idea. And not so much dark up here, but at the same time you do need some. And I think that's probably as much as I can do for the moment. What I, funnily enough, am still missing is that little touch of yellow. Just here, I've actually managed to make it still too dark just in a couple of those places. So using a barely damp brush, I'm going to push that one back so that I have that happening. There is other ways to do that sort of thing. Just don't know whether I'll tell you just yet. There you go. That actually makes a difference, I think, having those couple of little bits there. But then don't go over them. Make sure that you only go that way. I think that might do for the moment. We probably, at most, I would just muck up the shape a bit more.
Well, you're a bit handicapped because you ran out of paper on that edge.
Well, that's okay. I don't mind that side of things. That's all right, because it's all about, you know, I can just
That's
have
the
it
wind
here.
blowing palm.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right.
Okay, just before I quickly move on, just to help you out, if you've got too much dark and you've lost some of the lights, it is a possibility, if, depending on your paint, not all paints lift easily, but just to grab back a few of those lights that might have got lost. And it does depend on your paint, because if it's staining paint, you're not going to be able to do that as easily.
So you're just using water.
Just using water, and not even a lot of it. Whoops, that's a bad shape. So just changing up the shape so that it makes sense. Blotting a little bit, and see how much difference that can make, just to give yourself that extra little bit of light coming through on top of these. Alright. Occasionally when I demonstrate for a class, I don't do as good a job as I intended, and then the class struggles even more. This has happened this week. In real life, we do not always get it right the first time. So what you have seen is the same two trees repeated, and the second time they are lighter in tone. I have also tried to explain where the variations have occurred. It is not a bad thing to repeat a subject more than once. The learning experience is better because you can build on what has happened in the preceding attempts. The main thing is to make different mistakes and not the same one over and over. Of course, making mistakes is also an opportunity to correct them, and so I demonstrated how to lighten an area that ended up being too dark. An interesting class for sure. Next class we move on to flowering and coloured foliage trees. These will be a flowering crepe myrtle, a yellow maple with shadow, and a quick demonstration of a jacaranda in glorious violet.